So now, so now it's on record. So I would like that the participant switch their camera off and their microphone. And I will give the word to Pavel, the who is responsible for the organization of this webinar. So Pavel, the floor is yours, or the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Danny. Good afternoon. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Notas 8 webinar on pharmacoeconomics. I would like to announce that all previous webinars are available on YouTube channel directly or via a Nota webpage if you are interested in our previous presentations on pharmacoeconomics. We have planned a total of 10 webinars, which we started in January, and the next one have been scheduled in the following months until the end of this year. Each webinar takes about 30 minutes with approximately 20 to 25 minutes for the presentation and 5 to 10 minutes for Q&A session and discussion. Title of the presentation today is Economic Analysis Methods. And now I would like to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Konstantin Tashkov from Medical University of Sofia, Bulgaria. Dr. Tashkov completed his pharmaceutical education at the Faculty of Pharmacy, Medical University of Sofia in 2014, where he also received his PhD degree. He is currently working as an assistant professor at the Department of Organization and Economics of Pharmacy of the university. His main interest lies in drug financing and pricing policies, with a particular focus on mathematical models for predicting disease progression. He published a lot of national or as well as international journals, and he has attended multiple courses on pharmacoeconomics and statistical methods in healthcare. Okay, Konstantin, you can start your presentation. The floor is yours.
Okay, first I'm going to ask so that you give me the permission to share, yes. And hello to everybody. First of all, I want to make sure that everything is fine. You can see the presentation. And
yes, we can see it.
Amazing. So thank you so much, Professor Kovalets, for the introduction. And I also want to thank each one of you individually for taking the time out of your busy schedule. Now, I've been made aware that a lot of you are not professional health economics, so I'm going to try to keep the economic jargon down to a minimum. And I want to really focus today and talk a little bit about how health and economics, these two very distinct sciences, came together to become what we now call health economics. So hopefully, okay, I'm not being able to switch. There's a technical difficulty. So I'm hopefully, okay. So hopefully, at least going over it, by the end of at least this lecture, you're going to have a little bit of an understanding of how economics intertwined over the decades with healthcare to produce the field, and how gradually our way of thinking about health from a classical economical perspective as being a commodity to a more nuanced perspective of health being an investment, and how over the years this thinking has changed. And these are two very distinct ways of looking at value of the healthcare. We can use those two perspectives actually to assign monetary value to both the interventions and the health outcomes. So the way we're going to do this is, very briefly, I want to go over some of the important topics that have been discussed in previous webinar topics, and talk a little bit after that we can't get away without talking a little bit about the economic principles of healthcare, but we're going to talk about at least the four main pillars or the four main steps when conducting economic analyses. I'm maybe going to spend a little bit too much time on the history of health economics, since this is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. And we're going to finish things by giving very bare bones examples of how we use costing methods and how important the perspective that we use is when conducting our analysis. And if the time permits us at the end of the lecture series, at the end of the lecture, we'll probably go over a little bit or talk a little bit about the 2024 World Health Organization initiative called Health for All. So let's begin. In the introductory webinar with Professor Kavalitz, you already went over some of the main methods that health economists consider their bread and butter. So, for example, you review the main methods such as cost effectiveness analysis, where we juxtapose the cost of an intervention with the clinical effectiveness it brings about in clinical trials, or maybe a little bit about cost utility analyses, where we analyze the cost on the one hand and the quality adjusted life years on the other. What really matters for my talk today is that, and what you have to keep in mind is that you can basically boil down health economics and the analysis methods to two main mathematical operators. That is the costs on one hand and the results on the other hand. Subsequently, with Olga Pizzolitto, she went into very detailed overview of the whole field, health economics, and how it intertwines with the broader field of healthcare. And if we're thinking about health as a commodity, as a good or a service, then healthcare in this way of economical thinking is actually a market. And that comes with all the intrinsic things with markets that shape it. So healthcare being financed by public funds with institutions responsible for financing it means that there's a lot of resource allocation and a lot of resource planning that goes into it. And all of these things come together in the entire field and are tied together by the efficiency of health services, the level of development and health information that's intrinsic to a system. But something that Olga mentioned, and this is the second thing I want you to keep in mind for the lecture series today, is that healthcare is an imperfect market, mainly due to what we call information imbalance. And this shapes the way we think about costing and valuing health interventions. So how did we get here? Very briefly, many people might be aware, or some might not be aware, but for centuries, economists, social researchers, epidemiologists, and many others have analyzed topics that are at the intersection of medicine and economics. A very famous example of this is John Snow and the Broad Street pump, where epidemiological advances, he proved that a contaminated source of water was responsible for cholera outbreaks. So this was an epidemiological investigation that influenced policy towards providing clean water. What many people might not know is that this process was ubiquitous throughout Europe. So, for example, in the late 19th century, a lot of Italian physicians leveraged the power of Italian mathematicians and statisticians to actually provide statistical analysis of pressing healthcare concerns, and thereby drawing the attention of politicians and political institutions to problem areas. It wasn't maybe until the 20th century that economics gets into the picture, and the whole idea of money being able to buy personal or non-tangible value through health doesn't come into effect. And this can be traced all the way back to the 1920s, where for the first time, terms such as welfare economics or welfarism, welfare, became introduced. In 1920, A.C. Peugeot was the first to denote economic welfare as that part of welfare that can be brought directly or indirectly into relation with the measuring rod of money. So this is the first recorded instance of money being used as a measuring tool for health or any type of welfare. Subsequent research, and in the 1950s, John Hicks built upon these terms by using terms such as welfarism, welfare to denote social and economical well-being. The culmination was maybe by the World Health Organization introducing the concept of health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not just the absence of infirmity or disease. And this is a definition that we still use onto this day. Second half of the 12th century really took these concepts, ran away with them, and in the mid-20th century, the entire idea of health having value, which we can measure through money, really took a life of its own. And there are two seminal papers, the way I see it, and the way most health economists view it, or maybe not all, but my personal opinion is that there are two seminal papers that changed the way we look at healthcare. These are Kenneth Arrow's 1963 paper of Uncertainty in the Welfare Economics of Medical Care, and Michael Grossman's on the concept of health capital and demand for health. And I want to spend a little bit of time really addressing these two papers because they introduce two very distinct perspectives and two very distinct ways of thinking about health and healthcare. Starting with Kenneth Arrow, Kenneth was the first to make the argument of healthcare for being a regulated market. That is, say, a market that has certain rules, regulations, standards of care that are intrinsic and actually necessary for the normal development of the market. He framed his question by asking why healthcare markets don't behave like normal competitive markets. And through his systematic analysis, what Mr. Arrow showed was that uncertainty, information asymmetry, and trust ethics, which are at the core of healthcare, makes it fundamentally different from classical markets. And to give you a little bit of a perspective on that, when you go to the supermarket and you want to buy, let's say, a tomato, you, as a consumer, intrinsically know what the price is. Not intrinsically, but you know what the price is, but intrinsically you know how a tomato should taste, how it feels, what are the textures, right? So you possess the information. However, in healthcare markets, doctors usually act as agents for patients, and this uncertainty is baked into the system. So there are two things. Uncertainty in healthcare is intrinsic, so it means you can't predict when you get sick. You don't have information whether first-line treatment will work or not. So in this hypothesis, insurance becomes a central part of healthcare systems. Secondly, the information asymmetry where doctors know more about patients, about the disease being treated takes away the agency of the consumer, i.e. the patient. And in this way, with doctors acting as agents for patients, this can create supplier-induced demand, but also justifies the adherence to professional norms, ethical standards, and standards of care. Another thing he analyzed was market failures. Treatments fail. You're never certain which treatment will fail. Is it for the first line or the second? But because quality is really hard to observe and outcomes are always uncertain, in these hypotheses, classical market assumptions break. And it is in this space that non-market institutions emerge to restore public trust and to restore the trust. So there's, say, there are professional licensing bodies that make sure that there's quality and standard in production, manufacturing, registration, and also standards of costing. And finally, the last thing he analyzed was what he called insurance paradoxes. Insurance is necessary, but it creates what we call moral hazard. People consume more care when insured. So a very good example I like to give is if you really hate your boss and he's inviting you and your entire team to a dinner, you're tempted to spend as much as possible ordering lobster or steak just so that you can really stick it to him. And it's a similar case in insurance markets. Because the payer is a third party, patients are incentivized to ask for the best care available even when they don't understand the economic consequence of it. The second paper and the second way of thinking was introduced by Michael Grossman in his 73 paper, whereby he reframed health as a durable capital stock, thereby shifting the focus of health not as a commodity, not as a good, but as an investment. And if you think about stocks, what they do is they either appreciate or depreciate as time goes on. And what he did was he created a mathematical algorithm, a health prediction function that helps us estimate these things. So let's say you're born with age, a certain amount of health capital. As you age, that health capital depreciates, and you can invest through prevention, exercise, medical care to maintain your stock or increase your value. So, in this way of thinking, health results not just from medical care, it results from a multitude of inputs such as care, time, education, and environment. And what people demand is not medical care per se, but health overall. And medical care is just one input of the entire picture. What this led Grossman to discover was that there's actually what he called the shadow price of health. So the cost of producing or maintaining health depends not only on the care given and the money spent on the care, but also personal time. Education lowers the price by making health production more efficient. And a classical example of this would be a 45-year-old person who doesn't really take care of himself, doesn't really exercise. He spends his time on the couch, from home to work and back on the couch, watching television, eating unhealthily, compared to a 65-year-old person who goes for regular jogs, visits the gym twice a day, really follows what he eats because he's been educated in what healthy consumption is. And if you juxtapose these two people together, it's oftentimes the case where the 45-year-old would already have some type of disease, and his health index, his health stock would be already depreciated, whereas the 65-year-old fit person would have an appreciated stock because he doesn't have any other diseases, right? But fundamentally, what these two people showed is that there are two ways of thinking about health. One is health being a commodity that you can value, but the other is that health is also built by things people find as intrinsic values. And these are things that we can assign costs, and we can use the two mathematical operators of health economics to calculate and assign value to both of these ways of thinking. So, how do we do that? There are four main steps of an economic evaluation. The first and maybe the most important part of any economic evaluation, and I'm just going to go off on a little bit of a tangent over here and talk a little bit about the costs, the way we measure, the way we analyze things in health economics. So typically you would have two types of interventions, A or B. And what we want to do is weigh the costs and the consequences of each one individually and then compare them in order to get what Pavel Kovalets in the introductory lecture told you about as a cost effectiveness ratio or a cost consequence ratio. And in health economics, the perspective is very important since it tells us, it informs the rest of the analysis in which way to go. And we've broadly defined three types of perspective: the institutional, payer, healthcare perspective, the patient perspective, or the societal perspective. So in this classical example, if you look at it from the prism of a payer institution like a national health insurance fund, a national health insurance fund is just concerned with what are the costs of direct interventions, right? So what's the cost of a medicine? What's the cost of a medical intervention? Everything that's directly related to the disease, and what are the outcomes you get in terms of reduced hospitalization risk or improved well-being. On the other hand, patient perspective are oftentimes considered when conducting burden of disease studies, because what a patient values and what we can assign monetary value to a patient is very different from what the institutions. So in this example, some of the things that we can actually assign monetary value to is the cost of absenteeism from work, or we can try to value the time spent in hospital versus the time spent with family. And this is what burden of disease studies try to do. So here you can see from an institutional perspective, this is where classical methods such as cost effectiveness, cost utility come more into play. And this is where some other non-classical, like burden of disease. And finally, from a societal perspective, if one patient misses work, this is the patient perspective. But what happens when thousands or hundreds of patients with a chronic disease miss time from work? So what is the monetary value? What is the productivity loss by society from these people not getting the quality care they need or they deserve in this case? And this is what cost of illness studies really try to do. So, in essence, once we've defined our perspective, we know what the focus of our analysis, what it is that we want to prove. Do you want to prove the benefit from an institutional or a patient perspective? And that in turn influences the techniques we want to use, i.e., what costs we want to include in our economic values. Now, finally, because uncertainty and information asymmetry exist within the healthcare space, there's always a very important step that should not be neglected, and this is the sensitivity analysis. So let's look at this from both perspectives. In the institutional perspective, what Kay Arrow showed, and he really made an argument, is that because healthcare market is an imperfect market, there should always be some kind of standard. So Arrow showed us that institutions value standardization, and we can calculate the cost of care, e.g. costing, through these standardized markers. So for example, standardized clinical markers, such as glycated hemoglobin, or standardized drug tariffs, or standardized medical procedures. And most European countries keep registers of drug or medical care costs, and we can use these to calculate our basic input, the cost inputs, what we pay, and compare it to the health outputs and what we get. Typically, this perspective will only attempt to include direct costs related to the care and intervention. The patient perspective is what comes into play through Grossman, what Grossman showed in his papers. Patients value healthy time. So missing words leads to missing wages, which can be measured as productivity loss. Spending time in hospital reduces quality of life, provides stress to both patient and his family. And on a broader societal perspective, I already explained that this is what happens when we take the entire body of unhealthy individuals and assess from a broader societal perspective what this means to them. So what I've done here is tried to frame these two questions, these 2 points of way together in a very bare bones example of seasonal flu. So starting from the institutional perspective, this is the background. We have flu season coming just around the corner, and many countries are investing in vaccination, procuring the quantities of vaccines needed to give out to the population. However, there is a very specific group of people, primarily elderly patients with comorbidities, that are at a very high risk of developing complications due to seasonal influenza. And just let's say, for the sake of argument, the complication we have in mind here is secondary pneumonia. To avoid flu complications, you have 2 very effective medications, oseltamivir and zanamivir. And now the question comes, which one to use in hospitals or which one to use as first-line treatment to prevent pneumonia in the general population? So our objective would be to evaluate the cost effectiveness or cost benefit of both medications relative to one another. Since it's an institutional perspective, we would only like to focus on direct costs in a very specific population, elderly people at risk of complications. So what exactly is the benefit we're measuring here? Well, it's pretty much the number of avoided complications and the number of avoided cases of pneumonia. Clinical trials already tell us that oseltamivir reduces the incidence of pneumonia in patients who already have a complication. It reduces the incidence of pneumonia by 96%, while zanamivir reduces the same incidence by 92%, which means that for every 100 patients with complications, 96 and 92 respectively will be discharged out of the hospital without pneumonia. Now we just need to systematize and calculate the cost of treating these 100 patients and compare that relative to the benefits we receive from both of them. And as I said, a lot of countries keep national registers of costs and services they provide. So let's say, for the sake of argument, and some of the people, I think Professor Catherine Payne is in the call, she can maybe correct me, but let's say for the sake of argument, I'm doing this from a UK perspective. I know that the UK keeps, the NHS keeps a drug tariff where list prices and prices of medications are listed. And hopefully you all can see here that the 45 milligram caps pack of Ostelmovir, the basic price is approximately £1,500, while Zanamivir is priced at approximately $1,600. For the sake of our example, we're just going to talk about these two standard formulations, the 1,500 and 1,600 one. And we can actually try and calculate or try to see what is the monetary value of pneumonia. We can do that by going to the NHS payment scheme maybe. And I went around the 2023-25 payment scheme and found that atypical or viral pneumonia with single intervention with a CC score, let's say a complicated pneumonia path, is valued at around £7,000. So in this example, we treat 100 Ostelmovir patients with approximately £150,000, but we prevent 96 complications, and each complication is worth approximately £7,000. Thus, the cost-benefit ratio is 150,000 by 96 multiplied by 7,000, which I've done the calculation, is 672,000. That means, if we do the ratio calculation, that means that for every pound invested, we get 4.5 pounds back as return, approximately 4.48 pounds in return. For Zanamivir, the cost will be very similar. It's a little bit more expensive, so the valuation of 100 patients will be 160,000 for treating them, while the benefit in these 92 patients will be approximately 644. So that puts the cost-benefit ratios at 4:1. So for each pound invested, we get 4 pounds back. And now we have a measurement of how, from a government perspective, we say, Ostelmovir should be first line. We get more back out. Zanamivir should be second line treatment, and then we can form protocols. Broadening that out to a patient perspective, typically complex pneumonia treatment involves 7 to 21 days of hospital stay. For the sake of argument, once again, let's say our hospital is the best in the world and patients rarely stay more than 7 days. How much money would an individual patient lose due to absenteeism from work? So what we can do, the economic way of thinking is we can actually look at the average annual salary in the UK by region, and we can try to approximate how much each day is worth. Again, I'm being very bare bones, but let's say average annual wage is around £35,000. When you divide this by 365, you get £95 per day per person. So each pneumonia patient would lose, on average, £671 per week. That means that the cost of these patients that have been hospitalized with a pneumonia complication will be $2,684 for Ostelmovir and $5,361 for Zanamivir. However, on the other side, 96 and 92 patients respectively will not have to go, and they will not incur these costs, which means that these patients were saving them approximately 64 and 55,000 pounds. And of course, broadening this topic a little bit more is the societal perspective. Translating these benefits to a broader societal perspective would asks us to review and add social, environmental, and other economic benefits. A very typical economic way of thinking about the economical benefit as a society is the GDP per capita approach. So in the same way of thinking as how I calculate the patient perspective, we can go by and we can see that in 2024, the GDP per capita, so each individual's value towards the economy, was approximately £52,000. which means once again that we can assign a daily value. Each day that a patient spends outside of a hospital setting is a day where he contributes to the overall growth of the economy, overall GDP. And these are some of the key concepts that are involved in the economic way of thinking. Now, recently in 2024, the World Health Organization recognized that GDP is just one measure. And we don't have a very universal metric that captures all aspects of health. And what is currently being developed, and it's currently being talked about in the WHO, is the so-called health for all concept, whereby the World Health Organization proposes different metrics, different measures of health equality and health equity, different educational institutional powers. We need to be able to measure this in order to truly capture the societal benefit. And I'm just going to leave and end things off because I see 25 minutes have passed. I'm going to end this off with the quote from the World Health Organization. We need to start with the primary goal of health for all and decide what we should value as a society, and then work backwards to reorient economic and financial policy levers, positioning health as an investment. And I encourage you to go over. There's a lot of studies that have used these approaches in terms of what we do here at the Nota's work, and particularly in Crohn's disease. And with that, I'm going to thank you all for your attention and give it back to the chair for the Q&A.
Oh, no, the chair is Pavel. Pavel is...
Thank you, Konstantin, for your presentation. The audience can turn on your cameras and microphones. And now we have a Q&A session. Please ask any questions or just thoughts in relation to that presentation. So please go on with your questions and comments.
Yes, please. Thank you, Catherine.
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. Okay, I have one question to you. I would like to ask about, Konstantin, about some practical implications of the pharmacoeconomic analysis. Could you clarify which type of pharmacoeconomic analysis is used the most often in healthcare decision making and why? Very briefly, just to make it clear for the audience.
Very briefly, the most standard ones used are the cost effectiveness and the cost utility. A lot of institutions, because as I said, the last 50 years, health economics has developed mainly around evaluating the cost of an intervention and the health that you get back. Only in the last maybe 10 to 20 years, we want to reorient that in looking at broader patient values or societal values. So currently, a lot of institutions are still looking at cost effectiveness and cost utility analysis, but there's a lot to be said about multi-criteria decision analyses, and a lot of institutions in Italy and the UK as well are trying to shift the way of thinking and consider the broader perspectives.
Okay, thank you very much for the answer. Okay, I don't see any further comments or requests to our today lecturer, so thank you very much. And I would like to announce that next webinar is scheduled on 7th of October this year from 5 to 5:30 p.m. set. And our speaker will be Pierre Mehdi Houmoudi and Gavin Irayan Udamai from Medicine from France. And the title of the webinar will be Biologics, Industrial Production of Biopharmaceuticals. So please register for the next webinar. And okay, thank you for attending and participating, and see you at the next webinar next month. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. And hopefully it was interesting. The thing I want you to remember is that healthcare can be a value but healthcare can be also our societal values. And hopefully you managed to understand all of this. I really want to thank you for taking the time out of your schedule and joining us. And I want to wish you a good night.
Thank you. Thank you, Konstantin. And thank you all. And see you next time and for more news on Enota. Thank you and goodbye and have a nice evening.
Big Denis, kick everyone out. Kick them out.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye.